Good evening and welcome to this afternoon's program, A Family Revealed, From Slavery to Hope. I'm Bernard Green. I'm chair of the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee of the town of Brookline and a member of the Brookline Select Board. The MLK Committee produces an annual event, usually at the Coolidge Corner Theater, on Martin Luther King Day in January. Of course, in the past couple of years, that's been presented remotely, and you can see those remote presentations on our town website. But today we're back at the Coolidge Corner Theater with a very special program, which is one of many programs that the MLK Committee produces in addition to that annual event. These programs are designed to provoke thought and an understanding of the human rights struggle beyond the usual simplistic ways in which they are typically presented. Today's program will be thought-provoking and will be inspiring, and hopefully will increase your understanding of this very important topic. Today's program, like many of our programs, would not be possible without the incredible assistance and support of the following Brookline organizations and individuals. First, of course, the Coolidge Corner Theater. We're in the beautiful main auditorium of the theater, which has hosted our live programs from the beginning, save the 2 years of COVID, of course. The theater is an incredible and unique gym in Brookline that by its presence and its work becomes an invaluable part of what makes Brookline great. Brookline Interactive Group. We're also being recorded for future distribution by the Brookline Interactive Group, which has served and saved town government and town democracy during this COVID pandemic by making it possible for us to operate town government remotely. Brookline Community Foundation. Today's program is supported in part by a generous grant from the Brookline Community Foundation, and we thank them for that. Brookline Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. None of our programs could be possible without the hard work and commitment of the members of the MLK Committee and the staff of the town's Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. Lloyd Gelano, the office's director, Caitlin Starr, who provides direct staff support and invaluable aid and wisdom to the committee, and Sarah Kaplan of the office. And the MLK committee itself, over the years that I've been chair of the committee, has been comprised of many committed members, such as Rob Davis, who's really responsible for today's program. And thank you, Rob, for the hard work you've done to put this together. And after today's program, you will thank Rob for what he's done. Also, other members of the committee include Bobby Nabel, Ann Kaminsky, Christiana Atkins, and Jack Curtis, all of whom helped put this program together, but maybe more importantly, have helped over the years with the conceptualization of the programs that the committee has organized in unique and valuable ways. So we thank them as well as previous committee members. And now let me introduce Reggie Harris and Wallis Raemer for today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you. Meeting a stranger. When I meet you, it's not just the two of us meeting. Your mother is there, and your father is there, and my mother and father, and what they might have thought of each other. And our people, back from our folks, back are there, and what they might have had to do with each other. If one of yours and one of mine had met, what might have happened is there, in the room with us. They are shadowy compared to us. They are quivers of reflected light on a wall, but they are there.
And if I were a German and you a Jew, or I a Jew and you a Palestinian, or as this morning when you are an African American woman and I am a WASP. One of your family might have been taken from their home and brought through murder to murder by one of my family. It is there in the air with us. And if you're a woman in the city where you live and I'm staying at a hotel where you work, and if you have brought me my breakfast on a tray, though you and I have not met before, we are breathing in our lineages together.
And whether there is guilt in the room or not, or blame, there is the history of human evil and the shame in me that someone I'm related to may have committed against someone you are related to, some horror. And in the room, there is a question alive. What would I have risked to try to protect you as I hope I would risk?
We sit alone together, each from our different worlds, suspicious of each other, position flags unfurled. So much lies broken between us, lines of connection down, standing in ruins of pain and mistrust, searching for common ground. So we stumble through our points of view, logic falls apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start. Through the windows of the heart. We sit in silence and wonder, where do we go from here? Frustration dragging us under, no resolution clear. We feel the anger, this desperation to turn this world around. Each of our faces a mirror, searching for common ground. So we lower our defenses, watch them fall apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start. Through the windows of the heart.
Discovering Reggie. My sister calls. She's out of breath. Wallis, listen to this. I just got a call from Fran Adams. Remember her from overnight camp? She says she knows this guy who says he's related to the Wickhams from Virginia. He's an African-American songwriter and storyteller named Reggie Harris. He wrote a song about being a slave boy on the Wickham plantation in Virginia and says he is descended from General Williams Carter Wickham, our great-great-grandfather. And that he fathered 6 children with a house slave, Bibana, from whom Reggie is descended. He has a family genealogy that he's sending me. Wallis, this is terrible. Lisa was in shock that this could happen in our family, while I was surprised that Lisa thought Thomas Jefferson was the only one. But later that week, Lisa worked up the courage and she contacted Reggie and she reported he has a great laugh, which did not come from the Wickham side of the family.
The event that connected me to Lisa was not intended, certainly, to go there. I was hired again by the Swananoa Gathering, which is a music camp in North Carolina, and I was there to teach 2 courses, and one of them was on the spirituals and its connection to the Underground Railroad and its connection to times in slavery. And as a part of that, I thought that with my class, in addition to singing songs of that period and giving some history, that I would kind of fill in also and have discussions with my class just about the aspects of life in America that are difficult, and one of them being these connections. I had no intention of sharing this little information that I had. Actually, I had quite a bit of information that I myself had not quite dealt with yet. I found out in 1992 from a cousin, Kay Bush Gray in Richmond, at a family reunion, which we almost never had. But for the reason that we probably had was that Kay had been so inspired and juiced up by roots that she had plunged into a study of our family, and she gathered some stories from her mother and her grandmother and from close relatives. She still lived in Richmond. She was a teacher there. And she decided to then go a little further. Now, of course, this is before Ancestry.com. So she had to go the hard way. She had to take what information she had and start plunging into county records and tracing what she could. And it led her to this plantation or this property called Hickory Hill. At the family reunion, she took about an hour or so, distributed these booklets, and told us where we came from. And I remember sitting next to my mother that day, and we looked at each other and just thought, wow, this is powerful. But that was 1992. And even though we came very close to actually driving down the road in Ashland to see where this property was, we were actually stopped by a state trooper who, seeing us coming down the road on a Sunday afternoon, asked where we were going. And we said, well, we understand that there's a property down the road that we are kind of related to. And he said, yes, and the family kind of is hoping that you won't come down today. The reunion was having a service at a church about 2 miles from the plantation or the property. So we left that day somewhat disappointed. I was thrilled later when Lisa took me to the property because it really is 2 miles down the road, and we were planning to walk. None of us were that healthy at that time. So I held on to that information until 2010. And on that Wednesday afternoon, if things had gone as they should have gone, it would have taken until the end of the class period for me to teach the songs and talk about what I wanted to talk about. As it was, we went through it very, very quickly. I looked at my watch and I had a half an hour left in the class period. And I thought, what can I share with this class that would be relevant to our discussions? And I thought, oh yeah, there's that thing about being related to the Confederate general. So I told them that I had this relations to Williams Carter Wickham, and we had a great discussion. We dragged Thomas Jefferson into it. And then class ended, and I thought, well, That went well. And then Fran Oates was standing in front of me saying she knew this Wickham family. And she said, I'm going to look up Lisa Wickham. Lisa and I were good friends. And if I find her, are you interested in talking to her? And in the moment, I said, yeah, that'd be great. I didn't mean it. Well, not in the classic sense. I figured it would never happen. So there was nothing to risk. So I simply said, yeah, if you manage to make contact, please let me know. And I will tell you, I walked out of that class and never gave that another thought until a year later when an email came that said, I reconnected with Lisa. We had a great conversation. I told her your story, and she wants to talk to you. Little do we know.
So, Lisa, George, and Mason, my 3 siblings, and I grew up in Richmond, Virginia in the 1950s and 60s. We were offspring of a first family of Virginia, and we knew that the first Wickhams were as English as the Queen. And they'd been on this continent since 1658, living in upstate New York. I was aware that our family was prominent since there was a historic house downtown Richmond bearing our name. The Wickham House, built in 1812 by John Wickham, our great-grandfather, to the 4th power, and was designated a National Historic Landmark and considered one of the finest examples of Federalist architecture in the country. John was a Tory spy, later a prominent Richmond lawyer, and he was famous for the defense of Vice President Aaron Burr in his trial for treason in 1807. So, of course, in the 5th grade, I was assigned by my teacher to play the role of John Wickham in a class play about the legendary trial. Oh, God. And my great to the 4th power grandfather, like me, got Burr off despite a mountain of evidence to the contrary. John Wickham's grandson was the general, William Carter Wickham, Reggie Harris and my common ancestor. There's a little more Richmond history here in my background that I want to share, and so you can appreciate the picture here. My father was Henry Taylor Wickham, born, bred, and raised in Richmond. He was a lawyer and a conservative, i.e., a strict constructionist of the Constitution. As the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Virginia in the early 1950s, he was a member of the legal team for the Virginia Attorney General's office. He argued Brown versus Board of Education. 20 years later, when I look back, he represented the Henrico County Public Schools in their defense to prevent busing to integrate the Richmond Public Schools. So I have a little history there. Our mother, in contrast, was a Navy brat. She lived all over the world, born and schooled in California, lived in Panama, China. And, you know, compared to most mothers in Richmond, Virginia in the 1950s, I thought she was pretty exotic and sophisticated. She fed us artichokes and avocados, which no one else had heard of. And she quietly told us that she had been to school with people of color, as if, what's the big deal? However, as a family, and this is the important part, I don't recall any specific conversations about race. I knew that my parents helped Betty Bibbs, our family housekeeper, buy a house, and then I considered her like another member of our family, sort of like and other housekeepers that came after her, and they were sort of like our favorite aunties. We could say things and do things in front of them that we would never dare do in front of our parents. Betty was, of course, an African American. In fact, a fact that I don't really remember really thinking about much. It was just the way it was. So, growing up in a bubble of white privilege, I was not exposed to the lunch counter sit-ins at Thalheimer's department store in downtown Richmond, nor did I know that colored people sat in the back of the bus because I didn't ride the bus. And these rules did not apply to me, a white girl who was soon to be the WASP in the room. But soon after college, I left the South, and in the ensuing years, taught school, accumulated a few graduate degrees in Boston, became a school administrator, and in the process, I became a prototypical Brookline resident, liberal, I engaged in some very fiery conversations with my father. But when I look back on my childhood now, I realize how oblivious I was of the truth about my family, my history, and the harm that was done.
Oh Lord, how come me? Oh Lord, how come me? Oh Lord, how come me? I wish I'd never been born. So much of the history of the Hewletts and those like us, our shared ancestors, was dedicated to the everyday survival. The stories that were uncovered by K. Bush Gray were revelations, but they just pointed up that whole continuum of folks who came here as resource, came in the bottom of slave ships, or were born here into the institution of slavery, and then had to try every day to just justify the fact that they were worthy enough to stay alive. The struggle in the South, of course, is well known, but the struggles in the North are really no different. So it was that the Hewletts survived, and most of them stayed in Virginia. I mentioned that Kay and her family, there were several teachers, there were other laborers and workers. But my branch of the family, my mom's mom and her husband went north. They were part of the Black migration, the 6 million African Americans who fled the South, who saw no possible reason to stay there. Life wasn't tremendously devastating for all of them, but it was the constant reminder that you were less than. And so our history is just filled with folks who tried their best to achieve and yet just consistently and continually found themselves facing the privilege and the denial. So my grandmother and grandfather came to Philadelphia, and they began a life there. There was a tension between them and their family relatives in Virginia, as there was with a lot of African Americans with folks who went to the North. The stories were often fantastic, and visits home to the Virginia places that they had left behind were often joyous and yet bittersweet. Folks in the North were thought to have moved to the Promised Land, to a better place. And I can assure you that the stories that we were told in limited fashion or how hard it was just to survive. My grandmother and grandfather bought a house on 17th Street, 3714 North 17th Street. To do that, they had to enlist the help of my mom and my Aunt Sweecy, we called her. They bought this house, which was in an all-white area, by finding a black lady lawyer. My grandfather found work as a chauffeur and a mechanic for some of the rich white families in Philadelphia. And so he managed to find out things and to get places, access, and to start his own garage, and then eventually to find this house that he really wanted to live in with his family. To do so, that black lady lawyer, she partnered with a white realtor, and they, as they said, broke the block. So by the time the white neighbors found out that a black family was moving in, the deal was done. That black lady lawyer used to come by my house when I was a young boy. It usually happened about 5 o'clock in the afternoon after, I guess, she got off work. She had an office in the area, and she would stop by and she'd ring the doorbell, and my mom and my grandmother would go, and they would greet her like she was family. But we knew she wasn't family, and she was a little irritating because as soon as she saw us young kids, the first thing she would say is, "Are you young people studying hard?" And we would say, "Yeah." And she'd say, "You're not going to become something unless you study hard." And we think, who is this woman? Well, as it turned out, she was Juanita Kidd Stout. She eventually became an important lawyer in Philadelphia and then became the very first African-American female Supreme Court justice in Pennsylvania. She managed to get us into that house. Of course, the area didn't stay as it was. Within a year and a half of the time that my family moved in, the white folks decided that they needed to go somewhere else in Philadelphia. So they fled to the Northeast, with exception to one Italian family that stayed in the middle of the block, the D'Alessandros, and a Jewish grocery family that lived across the street. And so it is that I began my life in Philadelphia. It was not a life of privilege. I remember once in cutting my knee, my mom had to take me to the hospital, and it was about 8 blocks away, Temple University Hospital, and we went there, and I remember going in and seeing, as we passed on the hallway on our way to the emergency room, a big board with all of the pictures of the doctors and the trustees, the important people. That's what my mom told me. These are the important people who run this hospital. And I looked at that board, and I still remember that it registered that there were no faces there that looked like me. And a lot of my childhood was centered around the fact that we were less than. So the idea that we were related to folks in America who were somebody is pretty amazing. Although our paths, our narratives, as is so often true in America, were very different. But the thing that kept us focused was that history and that culture and that tradition. And the culture that surrounded me was song. It didn't solve the problem. Because in 6th grade, I was given the opportunity to go to a school not in my neighborhood. Someone told my mother that I, if she chose, could go across town. Instead of going to Gillespie, which was right up the street, Gillespie Junior High, I could go to J. Cook Junior High, and they told her it's a better school. A better school meant white kids go there. So that September, I went to that better school, which years later, through another meeting with my mother and my history teacher, a very light-skinned black man who saw probably a lot of me, a lot of himself in me, an eclectic black kid. That's what he told my mother. Reggie is an eclectic kid. My mother came home and she said, "Mr. Nicholas says you talk too much." Well. But it was going to Cook and then to Olney that put me on the path that led to me being here today. Had I gone to Gillespie, life probably would have broken very differently. But the one thing that really kept me connected through all of that, and to this day connects me to this legacy of struggle, but also to a legacy of reaching out across the boundary. It's what gives me courage to seek. It's what gave me the courage to pick up the phone to call Lisa that first day. And it's the courage that fuels my work in the world, which after finding out that I actually had white relatives and that my family history is that I am both white and black. That really worked to let me know that this passion that I have for crossing the boundaries of race and for crossing and opening opportunities to connect people with difficult conversations, I come by it very honestly. And what is that? It's a continual wade through the water of the struggle. Now, I hope that you didn't think that you were going to get through this entire thing without singing today. So I'm going to ask you in this moment to turn to the person next to you and say, with as much sincerity as you can muster in this moment, I can't wait to hear you sing. Your part's gonna be very easy. God's gonna trouble the water. Just one phrase, that's the response to the call. And it goes, God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, I see some of you already picking up the movement. I'll count to 3, I wanna hear your voices ring out in this hall, right through those masks. 2, 3, 4, God's gonna trouble. That was very nice. I'd like a little more attitude. I'll count it out. 3, 4, God's gonna trouble. So that's an answer to the call that comes out across the ages. Well, now, who are those children all are dressed in red? You say, God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that Moses led. Well, who were those children all dressed in white? They must be the ones getting ready to fly. I said, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. You say, sing it over, say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Well, who were those children all are dressed in blue? They must be the ones that made it through. Well, who were those children all dressed in black? They never gone back. Say now, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Oh, gonna, last time we say, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. I said, God's gonna trouble the water. Say, God's gonna trouble the water. Children say, God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water. I should add that the connection did not always make me feel comfortable. Going to those white schools and finding myself integrating softball teams and groups and clubs and spending so much time in the white world separated me in some ways from the neighborhood where I grew up. I now knew things, I had experienced things. It put me at odds with some of the kids in my neighborhood. One boy actually, when I was in my second year of high school, found me on the street one day and he said, I hear that you've been up at that school trying to be white. And I said, I'm just going to school. I'm just trying to learn. He says, no, that's not what I hear. There was a couple other kids who went to Olney, and he said, I feel I need to teach you a lesson. So I'm not going to do it today, but one day I'm going to find you and I'm going to beat the 11 daylights out of you. And he said, so I'll see you someday. And that went on for about a year. I came home from school a different way every day, a different time every day. We only met once, and that was in the middle of the winter when I was out shoveling snow off of the steps. And he decided that that day was not the day, since I was holding a shovel. But he terrorized me for an entire year because he said I wasn't black enough. And I heard that in other ways too. There was a race riot in Olney in 1968, as there were in so many places in America. And I found myself squarely between white friends and black friends, white associates and black associates. And I began to learn about living between these worlds. And I will tell you, most of the time, it was not a comfortable place to live. So I knew that I had a history and a culture. I knew that my family had this connection to Virginia. Every now and then we would go south and we would visit our relatives, but even that was always tinged with that tension because we experienced those things that we often hear. We always packed enough food in our car to make sure we didn't have to try to stop at a restaurant. We stopped in gas stations and were refused service. And when we got to Virginia, it was always a very different experience. My great aunt and uncle told us that we would go swimming to Virginia Beach. And they said, we'll go on Thursday. And we said, well, why can't we go every day? And they said, well, Thursday is our special day. So the experiences of being black in America, at one point in my teenage years, because of that tension, I said, I have no people. I'm a free agent. It wasn't until, as a musician, I began to experience racism in various and sundry ways and traveling around the country that I really was forced to begin to look more closely at my history, and I began to see the triumphant lives of some of those who had lived, and within my family began to appreciate the struggle that had forced them into the positions that they were. And so as I sit here today, I realize really how blessed I am and how blessed I have been to find connectors, not only in my family supporting me, even though they did not understand so much of what I plunged into the work and began doing. They always said, we're proud of you, and you go. I hope those white folks are treating you okay. And for those people like Pete Seeger and Tom Paxton, those famous folk singers, and for others who on my journey have contributed to welcoming me into a world of those who have chosen to take on the challenge. This moment is in itself a great delight and a great challenge, especially in our country at this particular time. I sit today with Wallis with great pride, because we have taken up the work that I truly believe will save not only this world, but this planet. And so that is what fueled my desire to make that phone call and to see. And I will tell you that the phone call could have gone a lot of ways, but Lisa is Lisa. When the phone rang, she picked it up and answered and said hello, and I said, hi, I'm Reggie Harris, and before I could get another word in, she said, where you been? I said, excuse me? She said, where you been? You're supposed to call me 3 weeks ago. I said, I've been kind of busy. She says, yeah. She said, I understand we're cousins. I said, yeah, and I expected her to say, well, what proof do you have? But her response was, how old are you? I said, how old am I? She said, yeah, I want to know how old you are. I told her, and she said, you know, when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of cousins, or at least a lot of cousins who liked us. So she said, I like having another cousin. And by the way, I'm 2 years older than you, so that means I can boss you around.
That's Lisa. So while they were having that conversation, I wasted no time at all researching this guy, Reggie Harris, and I got right on his website and his calendar, where I found that he and his partner Kim were going to be performing for a group of students in, guess what, the Arlington Public Schools, where I was the assistant superintendent, in a couple of weeks. So this is January 2012. And so I got to meet them and watch their magical performance, and I have a short video I took from the back of the gym because I fell in love with this work. Video.
Step right over here. And what is your name?
Zoe.
Zoe, oh, Xander and Zoe on the bus. Wonderful. You want to have a seat there? Right there. That's it. Well, actually, I know there's one more seat on the bus, but that seat is going to be filled by a woman who is actually not going to become famous for being on the bus. She's going to become famous for being thrown off. I know. It's the 1950s. It's Montgomery, Alabama. And a woman is about to be thrown off a bus. Who am I talking about? She is here today to tell her story.
How did you do that?
In school circles, it was known as the Bus Act.
I just couldn't believe how engaging and talented Reggie and Kim were. And when I looked at this video maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago and discovered it, I thought, look at these children sitting on the floor in the gym with their hands up, all excited. And it just made me think, you know, we've got to just keep doing this, and all the places where these conversations would be banned in today's world. So there was the picture of me and Reggie saying hello. I brought them flowers. We were kissing cousins then. And it was the beginning of this great ride. And Reggie, what do you think about that?
I remember being excited about meeting you, but also uncertain. I hadn't met Lisa yet. We'd been talking on the phone a couple times and a couple of emails, but I hadn't actually met a family member in person. And here, not only was, you know, Lisa's sister showing up, but she was the
big sister.
Wise older sister.
Yes, there you go.
Lisa told me a few things about Wallis, but I knew that she was also associate superintendent of the school, so I had a little apprehension. And of course, this was in the flesh. But fortunately, I think I was distracted by the fact I had a job to do that day, and you did bring flowers, and I'm just struck by how welcoming both Lisa and Wallis were. Knowing that conversations like this don't always go well, and that there is an overlay of tension and perhaps regret or whatever it is in the room. But we were clearly open to the experience.
You were. So later, that same year, Reggie came to Richmond, and Sister Lisa took him out to Hickory Hill, the Wickham plantation. And there's the photo. This is the property, over 3,000 acres of land. No longer belonged to our family or anyone in it, but it was in the process of being subdivided, and it was very empty and run down at the time. Lisa, as she tells me, felt very little emotion about being at Hickory Hill. Growing up, we didn't know our country relatives very well, but when we went out to visit, I remember imagining Civil War rebels flying around the corner at any minute. In fact, Robert E. Lee's son hid from the Yankees in one of the outbuildings. But this place certainly did not evoke Rhett and Scarlett at Tara in Gone with the Wind. But Hickory Hill was the plantation home of our common ancestor, Williams Carter Wickham. And Lisa and Reggie trespassed on the grounds and walked around and went through the boxwood hedges and peeked in the windows, and then Reggie walked up the front steps of Hickory Hill, the Masser's house. And there was a moment of silence, full of emotion, and Reggie would later evoke that in song.
When Lisa suggested that we go to the property, she said that the folks who owned it weren't there very often, but she said, you know, you'd have to be willing to hop over a small fence. And in that moment, I didn't really comprehend it, but as we drove up 95 and then off the road and then down the dirt road on the way to the property, I began thinking, okay, so you're going to be hopping over a small fence onto somebody else's property. You're doing this with a white woman you really don't know that well. And you're doing this in the state of Virginia. What could possibly go wrong? We had two friends with me who were also colleagues, and they sat in the car. They were two black twins, Hope and Janice Johnson, Unitarian ministers who were there with me in Richmond for some meetings, and they were marvelous because they sat in the car in silence, allowing me the space. And I saw Lisa get out of the car, and I could see on her face there were things going on, but didn't know what they were. And we weren't at a place yet where I could ask. And then over the fence, and then we got close to the house, and I realized after 10 minutes that none of the four of us had approached the house. We just stood about 50 yards away looking at it. And finally, I just kind of said, hell with this. And I went for the house. And I remember walking up. Lisa was following close, and I went up on the porch. And to myself, I said, oh, my God, I'm standing on the Masser's porch. And she said, what'd you say? And I said, oh, nothing. We recalled that later. And we recalled looking in the windows and her beginning to explain some things about the house as it was. And we were there on that property probably for about an hour or so, and then back to our cars to hug goodbye, and I thanked her for bringing me. I had no idea in that moment what I was really thankful for, because I myself was seeing ghosts. And then off to Philadelphia, and 2 weeks later or so, I called her up and I said, Lisa, I've been thinking about that trip. And she said, I knew you were going to call me. And I said, yeah, I'm starting to work on something, and I think I need to know what you were thinking that day, because we didn't say much when we were there. And we talked again for about 2 hours, and it ended up in this song. Barren fields to the horizon, ghosts of autumn catch the wind, memories of those saints and sinners gather round to haunt us once again. Now we are finally here together, standing silent face to face. Secret family undercover, born of shame, saved by hope and grace. Hickory Hill, we're on hallowed walking side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across the great divide. I can see the questions in your eyes now that we are home again. They celebrate the grand illusion, and they write it up for all to see. But in that mystery of confusion, there lies a truth that might one day set us free. So now our stories come together across these fields of broken dreams, and the blood that binds us all together is indeed much thicker than it seems. Oh, Hickory Hill, we're on hallowed ground, walking side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across the great divide. Can you see the questions in my eyes? Oh, Hickory Hill, we're on solid ground, standing side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across this great divide. Can you hear those demons as they die, now that we are home again?
Such a happy and sad song also. So fast forward a few years, and I learned that Reggie led civil rights pilgrimages with the Richmond Unitarian Church's Living Legacy Project and was coming to Richmond for a meeting. And so we decided to have a little gathering. My brother George and his wife Mary live in Richmond, Lisa, her friend Bill, and me. And we all went to a meeting of an organization called Coming to the Table. We shared our earliest memories of race as well as personal stories. The movie The Help had just come out, and so we often, our family discussed whether our live-in help had used our family bathroom or not. Most moving, though, were the stories of the African American participants, those people who shared and told stories about their fears of police following their children home. Many of us were just thrilled to be able to hear the perspectives of Richmond African Americans. And mostly I was impressed with Reggie, who shared his mission, which is to change people's beliefs through music. And I soon learned that Reggie and his friend Pete Seeger attended the same school of change and believed that, this is a quote, "The key to the future of the world is finding the optimistic stories and letting them be known." So, the next day, we went to Monroe Park, which is a big city park in Richmond, to check out the statue of our common ancestor.
Field trip.
Field trip. And it was installed in 1891, 3 years after General Williams Carter Wickham died. And we had lots and lots of questions,
We had lots of questions.
which the general, of course, was unable to answer because he's a bronze statue. But we were really curious about what was inscribed on the statue. Were there Confederate symbols there? Later that year, Reggie had come, should the statue be removed, moved? Should it be recontextualized? All the many things that people were discussing then, even though this was pre-Charlottesville, Virginia. We learned that General Wickham, I think you can tell, is in his Confederate uniform. It was erected by his Confederate comrades and the employees of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. And we wondered, was this a war memorial or a tribute to a man who was admired by his employees? And we talked a lot about Reggie's side of the family too. Would they choose to make changes? How would they feel about this? And mostly we kept questioning, was our common ancestor a good guy or a bad guy? Why had he fathered 6 children by the house slave Bibana? To create more slaves? What was their relationship? But we did know a few things about the general. He was a graduate of the University of Virginia, a lawyer, a farmer, a politician, a Civil War general, and an entrepreneur. He fathered 4 white children by Lucy Penn Taylor, the oldest of whom was Henry Taylor Wickham, my great-grandfather. He was the master of over 300 slaves. He was a representative to the Virginia General Assembly and had voted against secession from the Union. But during the Civil War, he became General Lee's right-hand general in charge of supplies, and he was shot 11 times. He had 11 bullets in him, and he survived. After the Civil War, he became a Republican and joined the party of Lincoln, which was extremely unpopular in Virginia, as you can imagine. And he and his wife also built a school for African-American children in Ashland nearby. But he was also an entrepreneur, and he was president of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. His vision was to connect the railroad in Ohio to Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, so that coal and other goods could be brought there. And he created basically the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. He wanted to revitalize the economy of the South, was his goal. So, Reggie heard a story, though, about John Henry. You remember him?
When John Henry was just a little baby, sitting on his daddy's knee, well, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel, said, "A hammer will be the death of me." As part of the show that you saw, which was called Dream Alive, I did a piece about John Henry, and basically just taking the song and translating it into a more literal visual for the children. But I was really kind of unhappy with that. I thought, well, you know, it's sort of a simplistic story. It's a wonderful story if you want to sort of tell it, which basically there were a lot of stories of that kind, talking about heroes and laborers. But as I plunged in to find out more about John Henry, I became very aware that there was a deeper story. And so I was looking around for some information, and I was in a flea market, actually. I found a book written by a professor. I actually have the book backstage. I meant to bring it out. And as I'm reading through the book, they talk about these songs that rose up, and that John Henry actually was from New Jersey, that he went south after the war was over to look for work. And like a lot of African-American men and other men who were looking for work and trying to make money in the South, which now, of course, was devastated, he found himself being accused unjustly of breaking into a store. They attached a figure of him having stole $50 worth of goods from this store. They said there weren't $50 worth of goods in that store or any other store nearby. But this was what was happening in that time, that African Americans were being picked up, charged with all kinds of things, thrown in jail, and then leased out. And John Henry was one of these leased out individuals. He was in prison, and as the book related, an appointee, John Williams Carter Wickham, took control of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and they needed workers to then work on the railroads. And so John Henry and 14 others were assigned to a detail and sent out to work on the railroads. And along with that was the story that John Henry, at the end of the song, they talk about the fact that he died racing against a machine. Well, many of the workers died. It was unbelievably, devastatingly hard work. And when you were signed out, someone from the railroad had to sign a waiver that said that they were leasing these prisoners, and then if they died, those prisoners' bodies had to be shipped back to the prison and accounted for. And they mentioned that the person who signed the waiver to send John Henry out was William Carter Wickham. Having read this, I called Lisa immediately, and I said, "Your side of the family killed John Henry." That conversation was short. But this is part of the difficulty. As I stood before that statue, we say, was he a good man? Was he not? But we know that in our history, that is the question. We ask it of Thomas Jefferson. We ask it of the presidents in America who owned slaves. We know now, of course, that from the early 1600s that the rice growers were among those who were opposed to the revolution because they were making so much money shipping rice all over the world. Slavery was so profitable that it was then earning millions of dollars around the world, and those people owned slaves. I get asked this question a lot by children. Were there good masters? It's a difficult question to take on with a 5, 6, 7-year-old child, but basically we keep coming back to the fact of saying, well, good, bad, otherwise, he owned a human being. So as we stood in front of the statue that day, we were all very conflicted about what to do with this man, this statue, and our relationship to it. And it's a conversation that remains in the family. How do you assign good and bad to the complicated, complex people who fill our family past?
So our next stop when we left the Monroe Park was to visit the Wickham House, home of John Wickham, and the Valentine Museum, which is where we viewed replicas of all the lost cause statues in Richmond, Virginia, which were sculpted by Edward Valentine. So they were next door neighbors. And we hung out in the beautiful garden in the back of the Wickham House, pretty exhausted by all of our exploration of our roots and racism and all the unanswered questions. But we had a nice dinner and ended the evening. But for me, that during that whole visit and before it, guilt was in the room, in the air with us. And I kept rehearsing what I wanted to say to Reggie, to acknowledge the strangers in the room and speak about my generational guilt and the tragedy of slavery, that my family had owned human beings and possibly fathered more slaves to increase their property and their wealth. So fortunately, the next morning I had some quiet time, just the two of us, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee. And I thought, this is my opportunity to share what's been on my mind all weekend. Reggie, I want to apologize to you for all of the destructiveness and racism and all the pain that my family has brought on the backs of your family for our personal gain and wealth.
Wallis, when you apologized to me that day, I looked into your face. You were still somewhat of a stranger to me. And yet, as we sat there in that moment, I realized that we had already begun to make a connection that was powerful. And I think I said to you, I'm going to have to think about that. And there are aspects of it that I'm still thinking about, but what is now very clear in my heart and in my head is a great appreciation for your willingness to open yourself to offer the apology, and a gratitude for the relationship that we have been building over these years. You're no longer a stranger to me. And even though we haven't worked out all of the details about this complicated history, I know one thing, that we are indeed family. And we're not family necessarily because of the blood relations. We're family because we have worked at becoming that. So I accept it in the spirit of our continued search for making a meaningful change going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will mention that I told my Hewlett relatives, my sister, my cousins, my aunt and uncle, immediately after having the experience of going to the plantation. I had taken pictures that day. And at the next family gathering in Philadelphia, I told them all about it. And while they were very interested and seemed happy to know, there was no burning desire from any of them to really make another inquiry or move. For a couple of years, nobody asked me anything about it. My sister began to ask questions periodically, but I understood in the way that life progresses for those of us in this world and in this nation, that they didn't really see a way to really make a connection across. Indeed, what I do in the world is sometimes kind of foreign to them. There are many African Americans who simply don't think that it's really worth the trouble to try to reach across that great barrier. Life is hard enough. But during the pandemic, I decided that we had already been talking about trying to find an opportunity to actually meet in person, and then suddenly we couldn't meet at all. So we began to have a couple of family Zooms, and we at least had the opportunity to climb onto Zoom a couple of times and meet each other. And I introduced these people that I had been talking about, relatives. I will tell you that the first Zoom went very, very well, and I was exhausted because there was a tension there and an unease, even though people tried their best to make connections and to ask questions. And because of the very nature of Zoom, and because of my sister who talks constantly and would not shut up. However, something truly amazing did happen not long after that. Lisa in Richmond decided to go and check out a shop that I think her daughter-in-law, what's her, Wynn's wife's name?
I'm not sure.
In Maine? Oh, well, anyway. Lisa went to check out this shop, and she parked her car on a street and then walked to the place. I think it was a clothing shop or whatever it was. And on that day, my sister texted her and just asked how she was. And they had a little back and forth. And so Lisa texted me and said, Marlene texted me. I said, great. And it went back and forth. And then finally, Marlene started talking about trips that she had made to Richmond and the fact that she almost was able to move to Richmond at one point. And she said, I was going to stay with our great aunt. And she lived on this street. And as it turned out, Lisa had parked in front of the house where my great aunt lived, which had a tremendous amount of sentiment to my sister, who was very close to my great aunt. And she and Lisa found through that window another bonding connection that now has continued in mostly text form. So there are these little windows, and there are these little remembrances.
So do you want to talk about the statue going down next?
Yeah, briefly, let's talk about that, and then...
So he mentioned a few of the things that have happened, the progress in our family, and when the Wickham statue, General Wickham statue, went down in Monroe Park, it was the first in Richmond during the George Floyd protests of the summer of 2020. My 2 Richmond nephews were out on the streets doing their part.
Every night.
Every night. He wrote a wonderful letter to the media, which was never published, but the New York Times picked up a previous letter he'd written post-Charlottesville about bringing down the statue and requesting of the City Council of Richmond to remove the General Wickham statue. And so the New York Times found it and interviewed me and Clayton and my nephew and Reggie. And then the photograph that you saw on the poster was taken of the picture of the statue down, was in the New York Times, with, among other interviews, other family members from other statues that had come down at the same time. But do you want to say any more about that, Reggie, or should I?
I will say that Clayton really sort of charged into this, both he and Will, but Clayton and I have had a interesting relationship. Clayton was teaching in Michigan, and I was visiting Ann Arbor at one point, and we decided to have lunch. And we sat at lunch, and Clayton looked me in the face and he said, I understand why we want to know you. I'm wondering why you want to know us. And in that moment I said, Clayton, I'm not quite sure. But I explained to him that this has been a journey for me, and that I feel like this was such a timely opportunity to live into the reality of the work that I do. This work that I do with the Living Legacy Project, which is a organization that, in using the lessons of the civil rights movement, really does attempt to move forward this great gulf in our history, mostly focusing on voting and civil rights, but this is all connected. So I was really thrilled when Clayton called me up and he said, I got a call from somebody at the New York Times. I don't know how they found me. And I said, Clayton, it's the New York Times. They find everybody. Well, that New York Times connection and that interview led to a connection and an interview with Don Lemon on CNN's podcast, Silence is Not an Option. And then we landed in John Lemon's new book.
On racism?
So the circle continues to widen, and the opportunities that come from this personal connection are giving us a chance to make an impact in the world that none of us really saw coming, but that we are slowly but surely embracing, which then led to other conversations in the family.
So part of the letter, I'll quote for you several parts, but Clayton wrote in his letter to the media that was never published, "We know that nothing can make what was wrong right. Our family's complicity in the brutal systems of racial oppression for personal gain, from slavery to Jim Crow and segregation, to our own too frequent silence in the face of present injustices. However, we would like to express our support for the removal of all Confederate monuments from our city's public spaces. In the meantime, our family spent lots of time talking about how to basically pay back and do good. And we decided collectively to invest in Virginia's Black community by giving money to local Black-led nonprofit organizations as well as we've made a commitment to the Virginia Community College Foundation in the form of the Wickham Hewlett Scholarship for Racial Justice. And this scholarship is named for all of the descendants of Confederate General Williams Carter Wickham, Lucy Penn Taylor Wickham, and Biana Hewlett. Bibana. And it is targeted for a deserving first-generation Virginia college student whose goal is to advance social and racial justice. And Reggie and I have just had this moment in the last, 2 days, where we've connected with one of the recipients, the first recipient, and she's just, all she wants to do is talk to Reggie, of course, and she now wants to talk to me. Also, my brother George and his wife Mary, who live in Richmond, they've connected with another descendant of the Hickory Hill slave family and have contributed to the restoration and preservation of a slave African-American cemetery that is at Hickory Hill and is still going. So those are the things that our family is doing besides talking about it. And Reggie, are we ready to wind up, rather?
Yeah, we should. And I'm going to ask if us to take like a 2-minute break because I need to go to the restroom.
Should we read this first?
Yeah.
This is the final paragraph that Clayton Wickham wrote together. Just as the statue of Robert E. Lee was never just about Lee, Wickham's statue was never just about him. It was a monument to the resurgence of white supremacy in the South. In all likelihood, Wickham the man really will be lost in the dustbin of history, but we hope that his monument and its removal are not. On the day of its unveiling, Wickham's statue became part of an anti-black narrative about the redemption of Southern white manhood. We hope the day he fell becomes part of the story of how Virginians dismantled the destructive legacy of that narrative once and for all, ensuring the truth will be taught to future generations. And April 2022, the pedestal was carried away. The statue had already been taken down, but this pedestal left the park. So that's the end of that story.
Reggie and Wallis will take some questions or comments from the audience. And let's see who, I see a hand back there. Do you want to just yell it out and I'll repeat it?
And one more song after that.
Or do you want to? Whoops, I'm sorry.
I'm Leslie Friedman, and first of all, I want to thank you for a fascinating presentation. I could listen to the two of you for a couple more hours. But I want to ask you about statues, statues of Confederate soldiers. I've read that, and I think it was in Richmond, that they were taking down a number of statues, storing them temporarily, and then going to find an appropriate place for them. And I've read about this in other states. I think they should be destroyed. And some people say we should keep history and learn from history, but I think we can learn from history without statues. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Great question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Go ahead, she says. My general feeling mixes the personal and the educator. It's very clear that the statues that were erected, most of them years after the Civil War, were erected for a purpose. As a matter of fact, if we go back and we look at the narratives of what was said as they were being put up, who was putting them up, and where they were placed, it was very clear that they were placed there to fight for the narrative, control of the narrative, to send a message. And the message was, we didn't lose the war. These are our heroes, and it's business as usual. So even though, and this goes, I think, into the larger question of all sorts of things that we do, or that are, I'm not going to say we do, that are done to solidify and contextualize power. So, in my estimation, the statues had to come down. It was unfortunate that we were not able, and Clayton and Will wrote the letter about the Wickham statue to the mayor and to the city council a few years before all of this furor. And all of these conversations have been going on for a very long time. What do we do with these statues, which are very clearly, every time you have to look at, walk by, recognize this huge, 60-foot high statues, really. But what do we do with that? Because they exist. So there has to be some ability or some effort, in my estimation, to talk about why they're there. And I think what happened in the pandemic, it wasn't a particularly useful conversation because there were people already on different sides, opposing sides. However, the very fact that it became such a news story opened an opportunity to really discuss the statue. And you're not going to reach people on either end of the spectrum, but for all in the middle, where most change happens, it was an important moment because we could actually educate. And I have several friends who are teachers and educators who do a lot of place-based education. They take students to these various places, and one friend did it around statues. And so we're able to talk to students and to the public about the reasons the statue was there. This was a conversation we were having as we stood in front of that statue in Monroe Park. We said, this statue doesn't represent any of us, but we all have feelings about it. And on the day that the statue came down, Clayton sent me a text and a picture and said, it's down. And I was thrilled that it was down, but the regret is that we do not open ourselves to having the conversation across the board with people. And I know that in so many ways, we don't have the language to do it because we don't really we have not developed the language and the atmosphere in this nation to talk about those. On the Living Legacy Project, we take people to a cemetery in Selma, Alabama. And in the middle of that cemetery is a leased piece of property in the cemetery that is owned by the Confederate, those who are still supporting the Confederacy and all of that, and to the leader of the Klan who is buried in that cemetery, Nathan Forrest. You walk into that cemetery, and for that entire square, you are in basically Confederate ground. It's an amazing thing to take people into that cemetery and to see that on historic, anniversaries, people come and they put Confederate flags there. It's as if we are still in 1860. And yet it provides an opportunity. So I'm all for the statues coming down, and this was the family. But our conversation about the statue was a very enlightening one as well. And I think in many ways, my own feeling is we have to keep the conversations going and giving us an opportunity to continually bring the reality of why these things were done and then talk about where we can go.
I'm Mark David Trachtenberg. I live in Alston. My late mother, Myra Trachtenberg, was an elected town meeting member in Brookline. And my question concerns, and I'll try to be as concise about my family's history with the race issue, their rude awakening, or you'd call it maybe a baptism of fire. It concerns regional differences on the race issue between the Northeast and the Deep South. Basically, what happened was that my late father dropped out of Brooklyn College for a time and was drafted into the Army, and his basic training was in Augusta, Georgia. And my late mother had an advertising degree from Baruch Business College, City College, New York, and followed him. And I guess one day she was working for writing advertising copy for a small radio station in Augusta, Georgia. And she was especially tired, and there was more room near the back of the bus. And she started to sit there, but the driver impatiently motioned her forward, and you know that. And then my late father there were 4 or 5 soldiers from Brooklyn who bonded, and one of them was a black young man. And one Saturday evening, they went to the fancy restaurant in Augusta, Georgia, and the maitre d' refused to seat the black guy, and they left in a huff and found their way to a nice diner anyway. And my late mom got to be friendly with the custodian of the radio station. He was also leader of a small black Protestant church, but he warned her that it might be dangerous for him if they were seen to be friendly outside the station. So, you know, it was like, in Brooklyn, it wouldn't have mattered where anybody sat on the subway. In Brooklyn, there was a cousin who sold life insurance policies to blacks and actually wound up joining the Urban League. So where do we stand now?
Where do we stand now?
Don't know.
I think any cursory review of the last 25 years would say that we are both making amazing progress, and we are locked in a battle. And I don't really think, you know, the common thought, I think, in this nation is that regionally things are, you know, that the South is one way and the North is another. And the West is, you know, obviously there are regional differences, but the fact of the matter is that our nation has always been involved and engaged in a struggle around race, as it has always been involved and engaged in a struggle on gender, as it has. So we make some progress and we lose progress. I think as we're looking now at the more recent decisions by the Supreme Court, the legislations that are making voting rights almost impossible throughout the nation, I think we are seeing that we are still engaged in a powerful battle over who is going to win the narrative. And I have never felt less safe in this nation than I feel now. And as I begin to travel again as a musician around the country, I am at heightened alert constantly. And I live in upstate New York, which is as racially reactive as Georgia and Mississippi. So I don't feel safe anywhere in this nation. I don't think that we as a nation are paying attention to the issues in a way. I think we are largely making our decisions on financial expediency, and people give lip service to making change. I think that there's a lot of change going on in the 30 and under communities, maybe 35 and under communities, where they are not holding some of the baggage that those of us who are older hold, and many of their ideas and their passion for change is certainly greater than ours, but they are not always the ones who hold the power. So I think until we start electing representatives on the national and the local level who are committed to a social change for justice and equality, that we are in deep trouble.
Hi, Reg. It's Martha back here, Martha Leader, and Wallis. I look forward to meeting you, old friend of Reggie. I think it's safe to say. In any case, I attend the UU Church in Brookline, and we heard about the racialized wealth gap and the difference in equity in Boston area families, where a typical African-American family's equity is $8, and typical white family's equity is $240,000. And we felt like this is something we really need to dig into as a community. So some of us did a lot of research, and other congregations, including other denominations, are doing the same. And one thing that's become apparent is the Northeast was really ugly and deeply involved in the slave trade and in slave ownership. Our first minister in the 1600s owned an enslaved person. We have at least 60 names that we read out loud in a service of lamentation. And part of what we're trying to learn about, which is my question, but I just wanted to give that framework, is learning about how you repair the harm. Some people use the word reparations. That can be sort of seen as just transactional or money, and we know it's a bigger journey than that, and a deeper and broader journey, and that we need to take our leadership from affected peoples, people of color, not just as white people say, let's do some good things and then we'll be cool. And so I'm just curious to hear actually either of your thoughts or both on repairing the harm / reparations. Thank you so much. This has been beautiful.
Thank you, Martha.
That's Jody.
I'm for reparations of the concrete financial kind. I know that's very challenging to even think about how to do it, and I think it should be pursued.
Oh, I'm for reparations too. One of the conversations, obviously, that we had, and I did not participate vociferously in the conversations about, where the family's money went. I told them I'm interested, but I'm not contributing to this. But change comes because people are willing to give something up. 2 years ago, a friend of mine called me up and he said that he was nominated for a Grammy. Some of you probably know Alistair Mook. Alistair was one of 5 acts that were nominated for a Grammy in the children's music division of the Recording Academy, the Grammys. And Alistair and several others had already been having conversations with their contemporaries of color in children's music about the fact that children's music for years and years and years has just been as white as folk music generally is. And they were concerned about this, and they began having conversations. The fact that, performers of color, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Latinx, whatever, never ever got nominated, never ever got, recognized. And so with their nominations in, they had a series of meetings, and they decided, 3 of the acts who were nominated, to go to the Recording Academy and say, we are going to protest the fact that you clearly are blind to your racism by refusing our nominations. And the Recording Academy kind of freaked out. But word spread and conversations were had. So they gave up their nominations. One of the others did not, but she made the case that all of the artists that were on the album that they was nominated were women, and in many cases women of color, and she thought, well, we're representing. So at any rate, this was their protest. And within a year, the fabric and the context of children's music in the Recording Academy changed, and this year there was a very, very high representation of acts of color in 1 year. But it was because they took the act of giving something up to call attention to it. So I think this is what really needs to happen. In my community, when I met with a group and there are almost no African Americans or people of color who are visibly protesting in my area, it's just dangerous. They started having a Black Lives Matter rally every week. It was actually a vigil. And someone called into the local police and said, I'm happy that they're having this because it'll be a great opportunity for sniper practice. And that sentiment is not one that was frowned upon in my area. However, people went out and they continued to be there. I told them the first week, I support you from here, but I'm not showing up. First of all, because I don't feel safe. And secondly, if a black face is there, it changes the conversation. And they said, we understand that. So week after week after week, white people went out holding their Black Lives Matter and their other banners to make a point to other white people. So it has been said many times that the problem of white racism will be solved by white people talking to other white people. Because, as I often say to my colleagues, they see me coming. I have a vested interest. But if you are able to speak to them, and that's not saying you will always be successful, but if you're willing to put your line, your finances, all of that on the line, then change will happen.
Okay, Reggie, Wallis, thank you for a very provocative, interesting, informative, educational presentation that I think will go back to people's homes and will provoke further thought, hopefully, right? And action and work. So, thank you again.
Bernard.
Thank